Welcome back to DMP Kenya. This is actually Turning the Mirror podcast, where we give you the perspective that many people don't see. Over the past few days and months, several people across the country and even beyond the Kenyan borders have been saying and speaking loudly, saying that Kenya is becoming a traitor in the African continent. So we want to have a look at this. Why are people seeing Kenya as a traitor? And what can actually be done to ensure Kenya gains back its lost glory? On the bench, on the hot seat with me here is my brother Owuoth Kaboko. Myself is Olengo Kwach. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm super good.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm with Kaboko. And it's true, Kenya has been seen selling out its neighbors and also beyond the neighbors of Kenya for the sake of political influence, economic gain, and outright betrayal. And this is from Sudan, DRC, Uganda, Tanzania. Kenya has shown itself as a hypocrite and serving just itself and its personal interests. Yeah.
So you've mentioned several countries here. Let me not actually say several. Let me be specific. 3 countries. You've said Sudan, you've mentioned Uganda, and you've also mentioned DRC Congo.
Yeah, plus
So,
Tanzania.
plus Tanzania. So let's start with Sudan. So why would you talk about Sudan? Now take us through so that we get to know what is it that Kenya is sharing with Sudan that is making Kenya seen as a traitor.
Yeah, Kenya has always positioned itself as a peacemaker. And now in Sudan, there has been, they have engaged in turmoil since the April of 2023 with the Sudanese armed forces, that is SAF, clashing against the paramilitary rapid support forces, that is RSF. This conflict has led to over 24,000 deaths and so many people, about 14 million people who have been displaced, maybe moving from their places, from their homes, and moving to different locations, and with the 3.2 million seeking refuge into the neighboring Sudan countries. And again, in the same chaos, Kenyan has shown actions that have not only been questionable, but have been that are so much into the crisis. And in a controversial move, Kenya hosted the RSF twice within a short period of time. And the first meeting was held at the government-owned KICC in Nairobi. That saw RSF Deputy Commander Abel Rahim and leading the delegation. This gathering was a precursor to RSF's announcement of forming a parallel government termed the Government of Peace and Unity, aiming to administer areas under their control. The Sudanese government vehemently condemned this meeting, accusing Kenya of violating its sovereignty, engaging in acts of hostility. And undeterred by the backlash, Kenya facilitated a second meeting after the first meeting, during which the RSF and its allies signed a charter solidifying the establishment of this parallel government. This audacious act not only undermined Sudan's sovereignty, but also signaled that Kenya is partially in part of the conflict, that Kenya is playing part in the conflict and maintaining the conflict and ensuring the conflict exists to date and even the time that is to come. The Prime Minister of Kenya, Musalia Mudavadi, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, defended Kenya's action. After all these, the public outroar, it defended the Kenya actions, asserting that the RSF's roadmap aligned with Kenya's mediation principles. However, this stance has been widely criticized both domestically, internationally, with the United Nations, humanitarian organizations. In essence, Kenya's engagement with RSF has transformed it from a perpetual peace broker into an active participant in Sudan's internal conflict, betraying the trust of the African neighbors and also broader international community.
Yeah. So that means that today, as we speak, one faction of the Sudan's in the Sudan's conflict is not feeling safe at all with the Kenya being part and parcel of the mediation team.
Yeah.
And actually, this has also led to several questions because today, if at all, if any country is to have conflicts, God forbid, then they won't really think of Kenya as a possible mediator who would then see that this role is well played and that the justice is then served.
Yeah.
Take us through what is happening in DRC. What is Kenya's role in the DRC betrayal?
You know, Kenya's backstabbing, it doesn't stop just in Sudan. Yeah, that there isn't action that we've seen. The situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo is another glaring examples of Kenya's hypocrisy. And Kenya sent troops under the East African Community Regional Force, supposedly to stabilize the region. But what happened? The Kenyan forces withdrew, leaving DRC vulnerable, with armed groups like M23 believed to have backing from Rwanda continued their destruction. Kenya pretended to be helping, yet its actions on the ground suggested a calculative move to maintain political and economic ties with Kigali, that's Rwanda, the capital of Rwanda, leaving DRC in ban. Instead of taking a firm stand against external aggression, Kenya chose to play a mediator between the failing to protect the Congolese civilians. And is this how a responsible African nation should behave? We say no, because it is behaving just like a traitor, not a country or a peacemaker who is really after securing and ensuring DRC remains stable. Yeah.
So actually, DRC, we did do a story about why actually Kenyan embassy was touched down in DRC, and we've also talked a lot about what is the role Kenya is playing in the current conflict and why the DRC citizens are feeling that Kenya is part and parcel of the conflict. Now, Uganda is not in conflict.
Yeah.
We just know that they've been speaking against the current regime and what the current regime is doing. So how is it that then, how is Kenya and Uganda involved in a way that maybe Uganda can feel Kenya is a traitor, or other people would see the relationship as a traitor? Take us through, what is it with Uganda and Kenya then?
You know, if somebody will think that Kenya is only doing this to these distant countries, like the countries not within its borders, Uganda is another case that clearly states that Kenya is playing a rough game. Like the Uganda's opposition leader, that is Dr. Kiza Besigye, once warned about Kenya's willingness to serve as an enforcer for oppressive regimes. And recently, the Ugandan opposition leader and activist who was abducted right in Kenya and sent to Uganda to a military court, and has been under the arrest to date, has not been released according to the demand of the court of justice in Uganda. And this one is only stating that Kenya is not deploying democracy, is not deploying according to the states of the human rights and justice and the international laws, and clearly against freedom movements around and inside East Africa.
Okay, fine. That is well noted with Uganda. Now, what is it with Tanzania?
You know, Tanzania also just recently, that is January 2025, with the abduction of a prominent Tanzanian journalist and a human rights activist, that is Maria Sarungi, who resided in Kenya for about 4 years after fleeing threats in Tanzania. Sarungi was forcibly taken by 4 unidentified men claiming to be police officers within the Kenyan borders and within the Kenyan government. She was held for approximately 4 hours, during which she was assaulted, blindfolded, and had her communication devices confiscated. Although eventually released, the incident has heightened fears among exiled dissidents about their safety in Kenya, and the Tanzanian public and the Kenyan public rebuked the Kenyan government and several leaders across the board. Instead of standing as a beacon of democracy within the East African region, you know, when we get to Africa, Africa is a little large, but Kenya is, we have the East African community that they are just like one region and one country in essence. And Kenya has become a willing tool for dictators and selling out dissidents and activists, seeking refuge within the Kenyan borders. How can we really trust a government that hands over freedom fighters to repressive regimes? It's simple. We, as Kenyan people and Kenyan population, that is something we cannot accept. Yeah.
So when we look at all this, we know that for a country to play a part, mostly it is its governing apparatus that are involved.
Yeah.
And so those who are also managing these governing apparatus are human beings. And therefore there must be interests. So we can look at the Kenya's hypocrisy, and basically without looking at the Kenya as a country maybe, what does it have to do with the interests of those who are in these powers and in the capacities, those who are governing or managing these governance apparatus within the country?
You know, Kenyan government, it is not about just having, being a bad mediator for these conflicts and also these situations that are happening in Africa. They are about people with interests, businessmen disguised as diplomats. From Sudan to DRC to Uganda to Tanzania, Kenya's leaders prioritize economic interests over justice. Reports have surfaced that Kenyan elites may have economic ties with certain Sudanese factions, business dealings with the Rwandan-backed forces in DRC, and agreements with the Tanzania and the Ugandan government to silence opposition voices. This would explain why Kenya has failed to act decisively on any of these crises, not even speaking to rebuke them. That even Besigye of Uganda, they've not spoken to rebuke the brutality that is done by the Museveni government to him. And when money is involved, peace takes a backseat, according to Kenya. This is not just incompetence, it is betrayal in another level.
And when we talk about Kenyan officials, because when this government just came to be, when it was just actually inaugurated and started working, when the president attended some of the African heads of state summits, he spoke and actually got a standing ovation. Because he spoke as a Pan-Africanist and was championing for African business and was actually championing for Africa, which is free from the West. What is going on? Because later he changed. What is not happening with the president?
That's very true, because President William Ruto loves to parade himself as a champion of Pan-Africanism, preaching unity, preaching economic liberation and African independence from the Western influence. And he gives fiery speeches about Africa standing in its own feet, breaking free from colonial chains and embracing self-sufficiency. But in reality, his actions paint a different picture. While Ruto loudly criticizes Western interference in Africa, he remains the blue-eyed boy of the West, making deals and causing up with foreign powers. He talks about de-dollarizing African economies, but takes Western loans, engages in partnerships, and that tightens Kenyan dependence on foreign capital. He condemns external meddling of African affairs, yet Kenya's foreign policy decisions seem scripted straight from Western interests. On one hand, he speaks about peace and neutrality, but on the other hand, Kenya is selectively involved into regional conflicts, aligning itself with Western-backed factions rather than truly advocating for African-led solutions. His administration claims to push for African self-reliance while hosting military engagements, trade deals that continue Africa's economic and political dependence from the West. Ruto cannot have it both ways. He cannot call himself a Pan-Africanist while being a willing puppet of global powers. The Kenyan leadership is playing dangerous game, a very dangerous game, one that undermines not just its credibility, but the entire East African region stability.
And because we've had some of the heads of states of different countries who feel Kenya is a betrayer or Kenya is playing its game unfairly. What are some of what are some of the things that we can remember, or some of the things that we can bring to the attention of our of our audience when it comes to a stained reputation and what other African leaders are saying when it comes to Kenya.
Yeah, it would have been bad if all these African leaders could have kept quiet, but it has not gone unrecognized. The Kenya's betrayal is on and it's being seen. African leaders are speaking out. Sudanese officials have openly denounced Kenya's peace efforts, calling them biased and untrustworthy. Congolese leaders have expressed frustrations over Kenya's inefficiency in intervention in the DRC crisis, accusing Nairobi of abandoning them at the most vulnerable moment. Even South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa subtly criticized Kenyan foreign policy, emphasizing that true African unity requires honesty and reliability, not selective alliances.
Yeah.
Tanzania, a long-time partner of Kenya, has also begun questioning Nairobi's double standards in regional diplomacy. Kenya's reputation as a neutral mediator is now in tatters, staining its relationship within the African continent. Even recently, the president of Burkina Faso shamefully refused to greet President Ruto in Ghana, rebuking him of abducting Kenyan citizens and brutal killings of his critics, because he has been championing democracy across Africa, that power must always be transcended in peaceful ways against the way it was done in Burkina Faso. And he says that, is this really what should be called democracy? And it therefore means that if Kenya will be continuing in this path, it risks isolation from its own brothers and sisters on the continent. East Africa and Africa at large deserves leaders who act with integrity, not those who sell their souls to the highest bidders.
And when you look at Kenya, we have several refugee camps like Kakuma in Dadaab, among many other refugee camps. And even without that, we always had Kenya seen as a safe haven for anyone, be it political, those who are fleeing their countries because of the political instability. Maybe the government is behind them and all that. And now we are seeing this changing, and we can say that things are changing. So what is going on?
Yeah, you know, Kenya has always been this country which is a safe haven, as you're saying, but the current political engagements that Kenya is making, they are so dubious. Innocent refugees bear the brunt of those actions. The nation, once a sanctuary for the displaced people and people who are seeking for asylum for whatever reasons, now stands accused of forcibly returning refugees to their countries and to the situation that they were running away from in their home countries. Just in October 2024, 4 Turkish nationals seeking asylum in Kenya were abducted and forcibly repatriated to Turkey, despite being registered with the United Nations as asylum seekers. This blatant violation of the principles of non-refoulement, which prohibits returning individuals to their countries where they face serious harm, drew sharp criticism from the international human rights organizations. How can a country that once hosted some of Africa's biggest refugee camps suddenly becomes so cold-hearted? The answer is simple. Kenya's leadership, led by Ruto, lacks moral integrity. Yeah.
So why should this be a concern to Kenyans?
You know, this is not just about Sudan. This is not just about DRC. This is not about Uganda or Africa, but this is about Kenya's growing reputation as an unreliable and untrustworthy state. Because if our government can betray a neighboring country in crisis, what does that say about how it treats its own people?
Yeah.
We have leaders who are comfortable with these double standards, talking peace while fueling chaos. Today it's Sudan, tomorrow it could be us, and you know that this government is to stay for just a while, but Kenya will stay for a long period of time with such a reputation.
So as we maybe come to an end of this show, what are some of the things you'd want to talk about as your parting shot?
The truth is, Kenya has failed its neighbors, the African neighbors. The government has shown us that it is willing to sell its soul for power, money, and influence. If we, the people, do not hold our leaders accountable, we will wake up one day and realize that we are the next victims of the great betrayal, not just within our government, but from our neighbors, our other African neighbors. And it is time that we must demand transparency, honesty, and real leadership. It's not just about Sudan, it's not about DRC, it's not about Tanzania, Uganda, but it is every aspect in governance within the Kenyan borders.
You've heard it from our very own Woth Kaboko here at the DMP Kenya hot seat, other words, Turning the Mirror podcast. I know all of us know what governance is supposed to produce, what real leadership is supposed to produce. Let us hold our leaders accountable all the way from the lowest level to the highest level so that we have a better country that supports its citizens and also supports the well-being of our neighbors. And therefore we'll have peaceful country, peaceful neighborhood, and also peaceful Africa. My name is Kwach.